Circumcision prevents self-abuse.
Circumcision began in the United States in the late 1860s as a method of preventing masturbation.
It's cleaner and healthier, isn't it?
The hygiene issue is hysterical to me. It goes something like this. This is dirty, so let's cut it off.
In Thai,
Are these physicians acting as modern-day witch doctors? I don't know that they took an oath to serve as agents for a social custom.
You don't want him to feel different from all the other boys, do you?
I went to the big American cop-out, well, I want my sons to look alike. But if I had any inkling of what I know now about it, there's no way they could have done that.
Don't worry, it won't hurt him a bit.
I'm sobbing, baby's screaming, the doctor's cutting, there's blood everywhere. And the doctor looked into my face and he said, there's no medical reason for doing this. And that was the question, I think, that literally changed the course of my life.
During the past century, medical and social fears about intact male genitalia have surfaced among a few Western nations.
Information on the history of circumcision in the United States is very scanty, and that is why I set about doing my research. And I have, to this date, amassed approximately 3,000 articles, all of them detailing the history of circumcision in the United States. In this country, there is a common thread running throughout circumcision advocacy. It turns out that whatever disease is the focus of national attention in whatever given time period, the circumcision advocates will use that disease as an excuse for circumcision.
During his research, Hodges learned that in the United States, genital mutilation began as a 19th century attempt to control children's sexuality by allegedly curing masturbation. Among the illnesses masturbation was believed to cause were insanity, epilepsy, cancer, prolapse of the rectum, and blindness, to name just a few. One of the leading proponents of circumcision therapy was John Harvey Kellogg, who also promoted the benefits of his own health invention, the cornflake. Many books of Kellogg's day alerted doctors and parents to the signs of masturbation: droopy eyelids, peevishness, rounded shoulders and nervousness, even boldness or shyness. To prevent or cure masturbation in children, a wide array of devices were invented. In 1888, Kellogg published his own widely popular book on the subject, Plain Facts for Old and Young.
As a cure for masturbation, in boys, he had this to say:
a remedy for masturbation, which is almost always successful in small boys, is circumcision. The operation should be performed by a surgeon without administering an anesthetic, as the brief pain attending the operation will have a salutary effect upon the mind, especially if it is connected with the idea of punishment, as it may well be in some cases.
But in 1891, English surgeon Jonathan Hutchinson became the first physician to propose genital alteration of healthy children as a preventive of disease, an attitude that would find increasing favor over the next 100 years. I may indeed go further than this and avow my conviction that measures more radical than circumcision would, if public opinion permitted their adoption, be a true kindness to many patients of both sexes. Of course, circumcision never did prevent masturbation, but to this day, circumcisers advocate its preventive aspects for an unbelievably wide range of diseases.
In the 1940s, when venereal disease was the focus of national attention, the circumcision advocates said that circumcision would prevent and cure venereal disease. In the 1950s and 60s, when cancer was the great fear of the American public, naturally, circumcision was used as a cure and a preventative for cancer. In the late 1980s and the 1990s, when AIDS and HIV has become a tremendous problem, the circumcision advocates have advocated circumcision as a way to reduce the risks. The U.S. military had a tremendous effect on the circumcision rates in this country. During World War I and World War II, the Army kept very detailed statistics on venereal disease. Venereal disease was considered a grave problem because it kept men in the hospitals rather than on the battlefront. Military doctors published reports proving that blacks were responsible for the spread of venereal disease. And so blacks were naturally targeted for circumcision. And many, frankly, very racist articles were written about blacks in medical journals that were published by the Army, showing why blacks were so promiscuous, how they were unable to be taught how to wash themselves, how they couldn't be trusted to learn to protect themselves during sex, and that amputative surgery was the only possible way of controlling them.
This incursion into the rights of black soldiers, at times under threat of court-martial, quickly became a concerted effort to amputate the foreskins of all soldiers.
And when they returned home after the war, they had been indoctrinated into the belief that circumcision was necessary. And when their children were born and the doctors began circumcising them automatically, parents didn't object. They didn't have a choice, but they didn't object because they had been told that it was absolutely necessary.
Almost all of today's medical literature advocating circumcision has been generated by a small but vocal group of non-intact males. Could these obsessive efforts to scientifically prove foreskin pathology also be an unconscious attempt to rationalize their own mutilation or to validate cultural beliefs? What is the psychology of a circumciser? Two leading circumcision advocates, Dr. Edgar Schoen and Dr. Thomas Wiswell, who might have shed more light on this subject, did not respond when asked to substantiate their advocacy. But while most doctors try to avoid controversy by appearing neutral, more health professionals are challenging the perceived necessity of routine circumcision, including Dr. Dean Adele, whose popular radio and television programs advise consumers on a wide range of health matters.
It's only we in America that cling to this outmoded belief, we squeaky clean Americans, you know, who have sudsed the world and cleansed it with our products and our antibacterial, you know, jihad. The hygiene issue is hysterical to me. It goes something like this. This is dirty, so let's cut it off. If indeed the foreskin is dirty, then the vagina is dirtier. If indeed an excuse for circumcision is that the foreskin is dirty, then we have a better excuse to circumcise females. Soap and water is a solution.
Rather than trust personal hygiene, however, mutilation of both sexes seemed a more dependable way to prevent disease. Female circumcision was espoused in reputable American medical journals until the late 1950s. Uncontrolled attempts to surgically mold the body to their vision of health led well-intending physicians to routinely discard body parts they perceived as troublesome and non-essential, like the appendix, the tonsils, the adenoids, the clitoris, and both the female and male foreskin. Of these, only routine circumcision of males remains as a solution in search of a problem.
And if you look at the history of circumcision in America, one reason after the other, it was originally started to prevent masturbation, which obviously didn't work. Then it was a promotion for cleanliness, and then it was decided that that really isn't necessary, that it's very easy to teach people how to wash themselves, and we don't live in unsanitary conditions. Then it prevents cancer of the cervix of the women, and that has been discounted. And that prevents cancer of the penis, obviously some validity, but there's no reason that hygiene won't do as well, as statistics from other countries have proven. And now the latest, which once again, now we've got a solution. Now here's the problem. The problem is now urinary tract infections.
Circumcision excuses espoused by Kellogg might sound laughable to us, but 50 years from now, will today's excuses be considered just as flaky? Oddly, the majority of infant male circumcisions in the U.S. are done by specialists in female genitalia, obstetricians, many of whom do so not for medical reasons, but simply to accommodate parental fears about conformity.
I don't know that they took an oath to serve as agents for a social custom, and yet that's exactly what they're doing when they perform medically unnecessary operations on unconsenting children. When fathers consent to this surgery for their sons, they perhaps unconsciously are really more concerned about their own genital integrity than that of their sons.
Fathers and sons will always look different. Sure, you may see a lot of similarities between me and my son, like the foreheads and the way our hair goes, but fundamentally we're different people, and everybody in the world is unique.
Yeah, the idea that you have to circumcise your son so that he will match your genital anatomy and will suffer psychological damage if this is not done has never been proven.
One factor accounting for so much concern over this normal genital structure is the fact that there is still widespread, almost systematic ignorance about the functions of the foreskin, even in the medical community.
I graduated from Cornell Medical School in 1967. I was taught zero about the structure and function of the foreskin, as were most doctors of the era.
As a medical student, we don't learn anything about foreskins. In my anatomy textbook, there's 2 lines about the foreskin. It's the skin that folds back upon itself and reattaches around the glands of the penis. And then the second line is it's the skin that's usually removed during circumcision. And that's it in the entire textbook.
And this is a very serious ethical problem for physicians, because how can they be removing a part of the body about which they know nothing? Now, if they are not taught this in medical school, if they don't have this knowledge, it's impossible for them to share that knowledge with parents.
The best message that we could give to parents and doctors, nurses, anybody that takes care of babies, babysitters, is leave the foreskin alone. Don't retract it, don't cut it, don't damage it, don't do anything to it.
In infancy, the foreskin is actually attached to the rounded tip of the penis. As this detachment occurs during the life of a male individual and the foreskin becomes mobile, it is then working as a gliding mobile sheath. The penis then during sexual intercourse can glide in and out of its own erotogenic self. This not only increases the pleasure for the male, but decreases the abrasion and loss of lubrication for the female.
A longtime critic of this penile reduction surgery has been world-renowned scholar Ashley Montague, who maintains that the foreskin is an essential part of male genital anatomy.
I, as an anatomist and neuroanatomist, can tell you that that foreskin is very highly innervated. And when separated, that is a serious injury.
Montague described a piece of normal skin the size of a quarter as having more than 12 feet of nerves and over 50 nerve endings. Recent preliminary research into foreskin structure finds it to be more densely nerve-laden than any other part of the penis. Far from being a little snip, infant circumcision destroys the inner and outer folds of the foreskin, which, in the average adult male, comprise almost 1/3 to 1/2 of the penile shaft skin, or about 15 square inches of erogenous tissue. 15 square inches comfortably fits 15 quarters. This analogy helps us to understand that the adult foreskin contains more than 240 feet of nerves and over 1,000 nerve endings, making the intact penis capable of sending more nerve impulses to the pleasure centers of the brain than a penis that lacks a foreskin.
When you're missing 12 to 15 square inches of exquisitely designed, highly complex and very nerve-laden tissue from your penis, it has to affect the pleasure dynamic and the function of the penis.
Some parents have very strong beliefs that their babies should be circumcised. Either this is from social or cultural or things they've heard. Rarely are they informed enough to know that they are damaging their babies by circumcising them.
One of the new insights in psychology is that there is a special human reaction to trauma. Trauma goes in deep. Trauma makes a big impression. It stays around.
There's often is a withdrawal response. They become very quiet and almost actually appear to be asleep, which is one of the responses that newborns have to pain.
We would like to think that it's just easily erased, or that it's superficial, that maybe it's just something physical. And when it's over, it's over. That's the way medicine generally looks at early trauma. Psychologists are learning that this is not the case. Trauma is serious. Pain is serious.
For decades, the medical profession held that babies did not feel pain or could not tolerate anesthesia. In 1985, newborn pain responses were scientifically documented, and while a few questionably effective anesthetics have since been developed, only a small percentage of these babies today receive anesthesia.
What we have here is the very first experience in the newborn is to experiencing all this excruciating pain when the brain systems, the neural systems, are designed by nature to experience pleasure. What people need to understand is that there is a common denominator to both female genital mutilation and male genital mutilation. And its roots are in trying to control, if not eradicate, the sexual passion, the sexual pleasure that is inherent, that is inherently damaged and impaired by mutilation of the genitals.
We have to confess that there have been no major studies, no large-scale studies, no really analytic studies that I know anything about to prove what the consequences might be later in life from infant circumcision.
Boys constitute 84% of all sexual mutilations in the world, 5 males for every female victim. In almost all cultures where female mutilation occurs, male mutilation is also widespread.
Well, internationally, the places I've gone in Europe, most people don't even conceive of the idea that genital mutilations of boys goes on in the United States. When they're told that it does, that approximately 60% of the baby boys born here are circumcised, they're shocked, because Europeans generally consider male genital mutilation in the same category as female genital mutilation, an attack by some superstitious individual with a knife on the genitals of young children.
I know that's cut is cut. It doesn't matter how you slice it or how you cut it. Cut is cut, pain is pain. It's just because of my own mutilation, my own pain. I felt that way. I said, the boy's cut is cut too.
Criticism of male genital mutilation in the U.S. predates our recent concerns about female genital mutilation. Ethiopian-born survivor Mimi Ramsey acknowledges that the common violation is not just physical integrity, but body ownership and self-determination. She questions the defense that it is done with the best of intentions.
How can that be love? Love is, you love the person without cutting. I don't understand it. I fail to understand that part still.
In her book, Prisoners of Ritual, cross-cultural sexologist and award-winning author Honey Lightfoot Klein discusses what she and other professionals have discovered about the psychosexual effects of genital mutilation.
The area from which orgasm is elicited in the body can vary, and the mind can move it around. If one area is destroyed, it moves it to another one.
Male and female genital organs evolve from the same embryologic tissues. The male glands and the female clitoris are designed by nature as internal structures, each protected by folds of specialized skin. Amputating these protective folds externalizes the glands and the clitoris, leaving them exposed to lifelong damaging effects of an abrasive environment. When this kind of damage occurs in infancy, could it explain why the non-intact male generally remains unaware of his loss until much later in life?
He's done what everyone who is damaged has to do, which is to compensate and move, the mind moves it to another area. Or we might even say that because he is not familiar with the orgasm that he's able to have with a foreskin, what he has is normal.
For a man in this culture to say my penis is not normal or my penis has some kind of deformity, takes a great deal of strength of character. So not every man is going to do it.
I'll tell you what amazes me most about it, that it's been a women's movement. It's been a mother's movement, that men haven't spoke out. That has shocked me.
In 1992, a body image survey by the men's magazine Journeyman discovered that 78% of respondents with a foreskin were happy to be intact, while 20% of non-intact respondents were dissatisfied with their lack of a foreskin. A preliminary poll of over 300 non-intact men in 1993 by the organization No Harm may explain this dissatisfaction. Their report revealed a wide range of physical, sexual, and psychological damage to men circumcised in infancy.
When I think about it with outrage.
Violation, mutilation.
Does not fully erect or erects with a bend.
Loss of the moving parts of the normal penis.
Deep psychological trauma.
Sexual dysfunction. Progressive sensitivity loss.
Pitting and scarring of the glands that can last a lifetime.
Damaged goods.
And that it provides me with no benefits whatsoever.
مساء الخير. أنا قلت ألخص الفترة الأولى من الدوكيومنتري قبل ما نكمله. أول حاجة بمسي عليكم كلكم، بقول لكم مساكم سعيد. بتمنى يكون صوتي واضح. الفيديو هو بيتكلم أساسا للختان منتشر بشكل واسع جدا في أمريكا، والبعض بيختن أولاده ما بأسباب دينية فقط يعني. فهو الدوكيومنتري ده بيتساءل بيشوف 200 بدأ الختان فعليا وأسبابه شنو يعني، والناس اللي كانوا عاملين له دعاية وأسباب الدعاية دي شنو. فابتدوا من الهيستوري من القرن قبل الماضي، إنه الشخص لو بتعرفوا الفكرة بتاعت الرقائق الذرة كورنفليكس كيلوكس، هو من أول الناس اللي دعا بإنه الختان ضرورة للحد من الاستمناء. فقال إنه ويعني قعد يكتب كتب ومقالات وبخصوص الحاجة دي، إنه للسيطرة على الحاجة بتاعت الاستمناء دي اللي هي العادة السرية، لابد من الختان، لأنه عنده أضرار فظيعة بتسبب ممكن تسبب الصرع، يسبب العمى، يعني الاعتماد على العادة السرية كثيرة. طبعا ده يفتهم من راسه. فقام أدى الفكرة بتاعة الختان للحد من العادة السرية. فبعد كده برضو من الأسباب اللي نشرت الختان بشكل واسع في أمريكا كان الجيش الأمريكي. فكان يعني بلاحظوا إنه الجنود بيقعدوا فترات طويلة في المستشفيات بسبب أمراض لها علاقة بالأشياء الجنسية وكده. ومن أهم الحاجات إنه يعني عدد كبير من الجنود كانوا من ذوي البشرة السوداء يعني، فبرضه بدوافع عنصرية إنهم ما بيتنظفوا كويس، ما بعرف شنو. فابتدوا القصة بختان السود. بعد كده فرضوا الختان على الجميع. بعد كده بقت عادة فرضت برضه في المستشفيات يختنوا الأطفال، فالأهالي بقوا ما معترضين. فهي الموضوع ما بدأ من فترة طويلة في أمريكا. الختان ده مش مربوط بالدين، فهي دي الحاجة، ده الأساس الفكرة بتاعت الدوكيومنت ده. فهي مربوطة بالحاجات دي. وبعد كده بقوا كل ما يطلع مرض يربطوا علاجه بالختان. الأمراض الجنسية الختان، الأمراض الإيدز العلاج الختان، الالتهابات العلاج الختان. مع إنه زي ما قالوا إنه ما في فرق يذكر بيناتهم. فدي كلها ادعاءات. حتى بالنسبة لل HIV اللي هو الإيدز برضه ما في فرق كبير، حاجة لا تذكر يعني. دي كلها ما بتدعي لختان الأولاد. بيجوا تاني يتكلموا عن موضوع النظافة، بيجي يقول لك أكثر نظافة للذكر. فالدكتور قال طيب هي بما إنه مدعاة للنظافة معناته إحنا الأفضل أو بنفس المبدأ ده مفترض نعمل ختان الإناث اللي إحنا جربناه، لأنه الإفرازات أكثر والمنطقة معرضة أكثر ومفتوحة أكثر، فالأولى إنه لو الداعي نظافة حقيقة الختان برضو يتم على فيعني بيحاولوا في يعني يفرضوا الختان ده بأي شكل كان. والأغراض هي أغراض زي ما قلنا برضو ترجع بعض اللوبيهات الدينية، وترجع لبعض الأطباء اللي تسيطر عليهم المعتقدات دي، وبرضو لها دعوة بالبزنس. الجراحات دي بتدر دخل عالي جدا جدا للأطباء اللي بيعملوا العمليات دي، ويعني فهو عبارة عن بزنس، وهم ما حابين إنه يوقفوه بما إنه مدعوم بالأديان، فخلوه على الحالة دي. وطبعا أمريكا من أكبر الدول اللي فيها نسبة ختان عالية جدا جدا. واتكلموا برضو عن غير الأضرار الجسدية، تكلموا عن الأضرار النفسية. يعني الطفل لما يكون يعملوا له الختان، كان طبعا في البدايات من قرنين مضوا بيفتكروا إنه الأطفال ما بيستحملوا البنج، في العملية دي كانت بتتم بدون بنج. فشوف كمية الألم، الطفل بيكورك 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 بعدين بيغمى عليه، يعني دي حالة بتاعت صدمة من شدة الألم، حاجة فظيعة. وبعد كده برضو اتكلموا عن الأخطاء أو اللي بتحصل بعد العملية، اللي هي ممكن يحصل نزيف، ممكن يحصل إنه الطبيب نفسه يكون شد الجلد لجهة معينة، يشيلوا الجلد زيادة، تحصل التهابات بعد العملية، في مضاعفات كثيرة كثيرة شديد يعني للختان. فأنا بس بتمنى إنه أكون ذكرت كل حاجة، هو لأنه قالوا كلام كثير. فأنا كنت بس حبيت ألخص الصوت. الصوت مقطع، صوتي أنا برضو. صوتي أنا برضو. طيب أنا عارفة، حاول أغير السماعة لو صوتي أنا برضو. أوكي. فواضح من الدوكيومنتري ده إنه هو دوكيومنتري ما جديد. وطبعا في أجد دوكيومنتري اتعمل بخصوص الموضوع ده، كان في 2018 اللي هو أمريكان circumcision. يعني كان قوي جدا كسر الدنيا. أنا حاولت أنزله، للأسف حقوق النشر ما موجود منه بس الترايل. ممكن أعرض لكم منه جزء في نهاية اللايف، فممكن تشوفوه يمكن في نتفليكس، ممكن تلاقيه. يعني هو المخرج بتاع الفيلم ده هو ذاته يعني أبوه عمل له عملية الختان، ولما يعني بيحكي هو إنه عايز يعمل الدوكيومنتري ده، أمه وأبوه اعترضوا، قالوا لي تنول حيشوف الفيلم ده يعني. فأبوه بعد ما شاف الفيديو اتصل عليه واعتذر له شديد، قال أنا ما عارف أعوضك بشنو. فيعني ده بيوضح لك إنه دوكيومنتري جميل جدا جدا، وحتى أبوه غير رأيه وعرف إنه دي جريمة يعني عملها في حق ولده. فأنا بحاول لو يعني ذكرت أي حاجة من الكلام اللي قالوا، لأنه حقيقة قالوا كلام كثير شديد ومهم. فلو اتذكرتوا بعد ما نكمل شوية في الدوكيومنتري ممكن أرجع على خطوة.
There really is a long-term harm to circumcision. Aside from the initial trauma,
Anesthesia does not solve the fundamental problem of infant circumcision, because all anesthesia does is it masks the pain. Unfortunately, anesthesia will never mask the mutilation. That will always be there.
many men don't know and don't want to know that they've been scarred, that they've been desensitized, that there may be other complications in their sex life.
Many men wrote in to say that they had to resort to prolonged, exaggerated thrusting in order to achieve enough stimulation to reach orgasm. And this not only
بعتذر قطعت. قالوا لي الصوت كعب، بتمنى لو الصوت حسي أحسن يا آدم ويا دان ماكسويل، بتمنى يكون صوتي بقى أحسن. بس أيوة ذكرت النقطة الأخيرة اللي كانوا بيتكلموا عنها، إنه الحجة بتاعة الأشخاص اللي بيقولوا لك أنا أدائي الجنسي ممتاز، أنا ما عندي أي مشكلة، الختان ما أثر فيني، عشان كده أنا حأختن ولدي. اتكلموا عن النقطة دي في حتتين. الحتة الأولى يعني رغبة الآباء، أنا بتكلم عن أمريكا وبتكلم إنه الناس اللي بيعملوا الختان بدون دافع ديني. فالشخص ده بيفترض إنه هو أوكي ما عنده أي مشكلة، فبيقوم بيختن ولده. ليه؟ لأنه هو عايز إنه ولده يعني يماثله والأعضاء الجنسية بتاعته تشبهه هو كاب. دي حاجة. الحاجة الثانية إنه هو ما عنده فكرة أساسا عن الفرق في الأداء الجنسي والمتعة الجنسية اللي هو افتقدها بالختان، لأنه ما عنده حاجة يقارن بها. قالوا لكم إنه الغلفة دي أساسا كأطباء كان ما بدوا معلومات عنها في الجامعات والكليات الطبية، يعني بدوا معلومات سطحية جدا جدا، إنه هي بتغلف فقط رأس القضيب وما بدوا معلومات كثيرة. فالناس دي بيقولوا كيف إنه الطبيب بيجري عملية ختان هو ما عارف أهمية هذه الغلفة والتشريح بتاعها وفوائدها وهي بتعمل شنو. فهم بإزالة هذا الجزء بيشيلوا النهايات العصبية الحساسة جدا، وبيشيلوا غدد بتفرز إفرازات مهمة جدا جدا تسهل في عملية الجنس بالنسبة للذكر وللأنثى شريكته. فهو الشخص ما بيكون عارف، ما عنده مقارنة، فبيقولوا إنها بتشيل جزء كبير من المتعة اللي لأنه النهايات العصبية ما بتوصل الإحساس المفترض الشخص يحس به لو هو ما مختون، فهو ما عنده مقارنة. فده الكلام اللي كانوا بيتكلموا عنه ونواصل فيه، وأتمنى إنه الصوت يكون كويس بعد كده.
their sexual experience in terms of abrasion and bleeding, but also in many cases their female partners, and it resulted in abrasion and bleeding and lack of lubrication for their wives or girlfriends.
It took me a long time, even after I knew about the real dangers and harm involved with circumcision, before I could fill out the harm documentation form. I procrastinated, I put it off, I filed it away, I did everything but think about my own harm.
The reason that we find men coming out in larger numbers now about long-term adverse outcomes from infant circumcision is because when you look at the demographics of how infant circumcision was performed in this country, it just about reached its zenith in that period between 1940 and 1960. That would place men born during those years at the age grouping right now in 1995 between age 35 and 55. So you have the largest pool of circumcised men probably in history in any one location here in the United States. And these men are beginning to report this type of harm because that harm is showing up in record numbers.
I am angry about my own circumcision, but that was a long time ago in my mind. But when I think now, 33 years later, that it's still going on even though we've landed on the moon, and we have computers everywhere, and we've gone through such tremendous social upheavals, such tremendous reevaluation of society and our values, that this thing is still stuck in our practices. That makes me angry.
Does a child's body belong to his parents, or to a religion, or to the culture? And what about the child's right of self-determination, the one who will ultimately have to live with the consequences?
Circumcision does more than just remove a foreskin. Circumcision removes a choice. That choice should be the right of every individual boy and man to make on their own. And to circumcise an infant, whether at a day or 8 days, is to permanently remove that choice and that right that that human being has to control their body.
What concerns me as an attorney about newborn routine infant circumcision is that each of these babies are born with the entire full slate of rights of both the state and the federal constitution. You may say that baby is wrapped in the United States flag and then the California flag and all the constitutional protections that go along with those flags. And what we see happening routinely is these particular rights of this infant are invaded without any kind of constitutional safeguards, without any kind of procedures to protect the sacred rights of the child.
I believe that this was really, for me, the first political cause in my life. I had been involved peripherally in some different political causes. I had worked some for the Equal Rights Amendment, for nuclear disarmament. It always felt very far away from me. They felt like good causes, in the abstract. I could believe in them, I did work on them, but it didn't feel like me. It was altruism. And this was something that was very me. It really politicized me. And I think it also opened me up to realize that if this had been done to me, then this culture can do so many things to so many people. And you really have to look behind whatever you're told is for your own good and whatever you're told is right. And really question it, not take it on for face value. As I got into my 20s, I think one day I just looked down and I saw this scar there that had always been there. And for some reason it just popped in my head and I said, why is there a scar here? Why is there a scar around my penis?
I first became aware of the circumcision issue in therapy. I went to a workshop where a man was being worked with on his circumcision, and I found a very visceral reaction to what was happening there that I wound up working on in my own healing.
As I did the research, I got more angry and more upset as the rationale that my mother had originally given me when I was 5 years old and that everyone had given me and that the culture gives us started to slip away. You know, when I didn't have that reason anymore to feel like this was done for my own good.
I know that the most painful part of my life was the whole circumcision experience. First, the complete lack of information, much less decision-making that I had on a major thing that was happening to my body. Secondly, how we in this culture in general, especially, do not regard the wishes and needs of young people, babies in particular, very much.
It tells me that we don't listen, that we could go on for years believing that babies don't feel any pain when this is done to them, without thinking that if this was done to me, would I feel any pain? Why is a baby different? Doctors were telling this to parents. Doctors who did it, who had seen it done, who had seen the baby screaming, were telling parents this. And I really think they probably believed it. Even though that baby was screaming in front of them, I think they probably believed that that baby was not feeling pain. Or that because the baby as a man later would probably not remember what he had been through, it therefore was not important, that it had no impact.
There are many, many reasons why I think we did the right thing by leaving our son intact here. First of all, he didn't get the psychological trauma that I got that ruined a substantial portion of my childhood. He has the choice to do it himself if he wants to have that done at a later time for some reason which I couldn't fathom. His sexuality is unimpaired. He has got his God-given sexuality.
The scar that 80% of American men carry, circumcised American men carry, is not simply the dark ring around the penis where the cut healed, but it's actually everything from that point forward, including the glands, which has scarified and keratinized over years because it had to be torn apart in order to successfully complete the circumcision.
He escaped some of the other horrible things that can happen, like skin bridges, the hemorrhage, the sepsis. I mean, for heaven's sake, some children actually die from this.
The medical providers hide this information. For example, the lawsuit that took place up in Alaska recently, which involved a boy who developed paralysis as a result of an infection to the brain from his circumcision, was lost at the trial level and was just recently overturned by the Alaska Supreme Court because the hospital conveniently lost all of this child's medical records. These are injuries that are occurring unnecessarily because the circumcision procedure itself is unnecessary.
Doctors do, in fact, try to market circumcision to people. I think that they try to make parents feel guilty that they're not doing the best technical possible medical things for their children. I think it is a money game for the doctors. I think it's a money game for the insurance people.
We're talking about $1.25 billion a year industry. 1,250,000 infant boys circumcised in the United States yearly at $100 a pop. Pal, that's $1.25 billion a year. That's a lot of incentive, let me tell you.
Monetary incentive for male sexual mutilation is a recent development. For centuries, male elders have mutilated countless millions of boys, and for centuries, men have borne these childhood genital scars in isolation and silence.
What I get out of
But times are changing, and men are talking to one another about the impact of sexual mutilation on their lives. They're meeting to discuss methods of regaining their natural genital integrity, and they're coming together to challenge both the secular and the religious practice of infant genital mutilation.
It seems like we have cultural blinders.
One frequently hears the argument, well, it's better to have it done at birth because at least it's over with. But there are a number of reasons why it's really worse to have it done at birth. At least in an adult, the foreskin is fully developed differentiated tissue, as is the glands. But for an infant, with the membrane that binds the foreskin and the glands together at birth in the normal infant, the synechia, that needs to be torn. Just the fact that you need to tear this tissue off of an infant, this undeveloped tissue, in order to cut it, that should tell any reasonable person that this is obviously an operation that should not be performed.
Circumcision became an issue for me about 5 years ago, and prior to that I had the same attitude as anyone else. It was subject for jokes, nothing else, and I barely knew what it was. But I was attending a sexuality conference in which they used live models to demonstrate genitals, and they were not even talking about circumcision. They were just showing normal genitals, and their male model happened to be uncircumcised. And when I saw how he looked and how he functioned, I heard him describe the feelings that he had in areas that were essentially destroyed in me, I was immediately overwhelmed. I began crying. I was just blown away by it. Its emotional impact was couldn't be denied.
And as a gay man, I have had a lover who was intact. And through that, I have become aware. You know, I was able to have that conversation and became aware that it is very different. And things that I thought were just genetically different in us were in fact physiological, you know, because of my circumcision.
When my sons were born, I didn't know anything about it really. I had a gut feeling. I really didn't want it done, but I grew up in this fundamental religious background, and it had to be done. You know, it's the American way, it's the Christian way, you've got to do this. But just something inside me said I didn't want to do it. But I succumbed with my first son because I didn't know why.
You just have to cut.
Wounding the sexual organs of male infants is increasingly being questioned not only by the general public, but by many in the Jewish community as well.
This is my son, and this is a life that I cherish, and I'm not even going to cut him for God.
So what do you think God's response would have been to that?
I think that God would have said, "Good, you passed the test."
I agree with you.
Miriam Pollack has spent over 20 years as a Jewish educator. As a mother of 2 sons, She witnessed the amputation of their foreskins in the traditional Jewish ceremony, or bris. Those experiences have led her to re-examine the bris ritual.
What does it mean when we take a knife to a child's genitals, and where does that come from inside of our culture and inside of our psyches? And I've had to ask these questions even though, or because I chose to circumcise my boys, as thinking this was the only way to bring them into this faith and people that I love and am very connected to. What I have learned and what I understand about circumcision is that it was a pre-Judaic rite. It did not originate with Jews. That Judaism had been a very powerfully matrilineal culture in terms of Orthodox Judaism and even the law of the State of Israel. The whole issue of who is a Jew, the identity of a Jew, is if your mother is a Jew, you are a Jew.
The use of the foreskin to that organ is evident. The bodily injury caused to that organ is exactly that which is desired. There is no doubt that circumcision weakens the power of sexual excitement and sometimes lessens the natural enjoyment. Our sages say distinctly, it is hard for a woman with whom an uncircumcised has had sexual intercourse to separate from him.
Moses Maimonides was a very great 12th century Jewish philosopher, physician, and rabbi. Maimonides revealed to us that circumcision performs two functions. One, it deals with the fear of woman, and the other, the fear of pleasure. And part of circumcision, I feel, is a way of competing with this matrilineal, this very strong matrilineal heritage within Judaism. Circumcision accomplishes this by violently breaching the maternal-infant bond, by mutilating the baby on his sexual organ, by bonding the baby boy with the men of the community and the men from generations before him, and with a God that is imaged as male. And by psychosexually wounding this baby boy. Circumcision is fundamental to patriarchy, but it is not holy. And so we must ask, who is defining what is sacred here? Where is the sacredness of the mother's feelings to protect her newborn child?
My father is a rabbi, so from a very early age I was trained in religious teachings and had full exposure to all of the Jewish rituals. I was taught to believe that circumcision was very special, that it made me special, that somehow it made me elite, it made me part of a greater family of Jews, and also that I was better in some ways because I had been circumcised. I was more civilized, I was more clean, I was more disciplined.
Well, even the circumcision that we do today is a relatively modern procedure in that it came during the Hellenistic period. And it's much more drastic than the original circumcision, which was a removal of the bit of the foreskin that was past the glans. It was changed was because of what was perceived as assimilation into the larger Greek society.
I feel very proud of being a Jew because of our long tradition of education and our long tradition of discussion. And I feel sort of sad that although even among religious Jews, you can question God and question the decisions of God, it seems like you can't question circumcision without being labeled an anti-Semite. And that's absurd.
What kind of ceremony can we create, or have there been ceremonies that have already been created that will make up for the Brit Milah, that will also be a Brit, the covenant, that will bring the child into the Jewish family?
I attended one, and it was a wonderful ceremony. The parents and grandparents were there. Actually, there were cousins and aunts and uncles that were there.
There won't be a milah with that Brit, which means there won't be any surgical procedure.
Everybody was smiling from ear to ear. There was no reason for anybody to get ill at it, as I've heard of, some people getting ill at Brit Milah.
Blessed is your coming in the name of God.
Philosophy and science have brought us to a new understanding of laws and relationships between mankind, God, and nature. Thank you, O Lord, for bestowing on us this understanding. Barechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, ve'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichunecha, Sar Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. To each of you, upon each of you, we ask God's blessing.
There was just incredible joy in welcoming this child into the Jewish family.
Jews should also know.
أتمنى تكونوا استمتعتوا، بس معتذر لو الصوت ما واضح أو كده. بس حبيت ألخص الحتة دي، والباقي يعني بيتعلق باليهود وتجاربهم كده. فكانوا بيتكلموا عن يعني تجارب البعض، وكيف إنه الذكور ما بيكتشفوا إنه هم فاقدين حاجة إلا بالصدفة. يشوف إعلان، يشوف حاجة، يلاحظ إنه في فرق، بعد كده يشوف الرياكشن ويعرف إنه هو ناقصه حاجات هو ما عارف عنها. فبرضو يتكلموا عن التروما، صدمة في عملية الختان نفسها. يعني طبعا هم بيفضلوا إنه يتم الختان في عمر صغير شديد، 7 أيام من الولادة، أو في المستشفيات الأمريكية 3 أيام، لأنه بيفترضوا إنه الطفل ده ما حيتذكر لما يكبر. لكن هو بيخش في صدمة نفسية وشوك شديد، ويعني عملية مؤلمة حقيقة. فيعني أغلب البارت ده كان بيتكلم عن تجارب بعض الأشخاص بالنسبة للختان، وكيف إنه هو موضوع يعني صعب نفسيا بالنسبة لهم، وكيف إنهم ما عايزين يكرروا الحاجة دي في أولادهم، ما عايزين إنهم يمروا بنفس المشاكل اللي مروا بها، وإنه في مشكلة بالنسبة للذكور إنه يطلعوا يتكلموا يقولوا إنه في مشكلة، عندنا حاجة، أو في اللي هو السكار، الندبة بتاعت العملية والمشاكل دي. فيعني أغلب الثورات جات من الأمهات، هم ما عايزين الحاجة دي، أو حسوا بالذنب، أو حسوا بإنه يعني عملوا جريمة في أولادهم. ونتمنى إنه الناس تفهم إنه دي جريمة شنيعة شديد. وحبيت بس أشارك معاكم الجزء من الترايل بتاع الفيلم، والناس المشتركين في النتفليكس على ما أعتقد موجود، ما عارفة بيكون موجود أو شال لغاية. هو يعني أصدر سنة 2018، وكان دوكيومنتري جميل، يتكلموا فيه مجموعة من الأطباء وشرحوا فيه المشاكل والحاجات بشكل مفصل، ولمنظمات الصحة منظمة الصحة العالمية بتغض الطرف عن الموضوع ده. نشوف الترايل مع بعض. بعتذر لعدم الترايل، ده جزء من الدوكيومنتري لأحد الأطباء.
Of welcoming a Jewish baby boy into the community. It is the circumcision, which is part of this ritual, is based on a commandment in the Torah, which God tells Abraham that all Jewish males shall be circumcised on the 8th day. So the circumcision is performed by a ritual circumciser called a moil, who is trained to do circumcisions. Very often, these days, a moil is also a medical doctor, but not necessarily. So this is done very often in the family's home. It's considered a celebration. Family and friends
بيشرح
are
عن
invited.
عادة الختان اليهودية وكيف ضغط على المجتمع الأمريكي.
And there is a ceremony. Prayers are said. And the circumcision is performed publicly in front of all these people. And this is what I attended back in the 80s, this event of a circumcision being done in front of all these people. And it's very common that, you know, Jews would be a little uncomfortable attending these things, particularly if you've been to one before and you know what you're getting into. I think people hope the baby doesn't cry, because if the baby cries, that makes people more uncomfortable. So if the baby doesn't cry, that can be explained, that the baby is withdrawing into a state of shock. But what adults tend to believe is that, well, it's not painful if the baby's not crying. And what's actually the case is it's overwhelmingly painful, and the baby is escaping psychologically because he can't escape physically. So, you know, there's this discomfort that accompanies the ritual, and the belief is among Jews that all Jews circumcise their baby boys. This is something you have to do, quote unquote. And I've talked with very intelligent Jewish mothers who question a lot of things, very open-minded, question all kinds of different cultural assumptions. And then, you know, when I raise the question of circumcision to them, they look at me, you know, I never thought about that. And it's amazing that this gets kind of blocked off in a separate compartment in their minds without raising a question. And I think part of it is the consequences of questioning circumcision, if you're Jewish, can be profound, because the belief is if all Jews circumcised, you think, well, you know, hey, I can't be the only one. I can't be the first one to refuse to circumcise my son. They're likely to get into an argument with their spouse or their family or everybody else in the family who is circumcised. I mean, they'll get phone calls from family members saying, well, when's the bris? Expecting, not when's the bris, but where's the bris? I mean, they assume there's going to be a bris. They just want to know, you know, some family members may be encouraging the parents. Of course, you're going to have a bris, aren't you? And so the bottom line is there's a lot of pressure to have a baby boy circumcised if you're Jewish. So the other side of that is there's also a growing recognition, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, that some Jews don't circumcise. And this is a very important message because it's one to inform Jews that you have company if you're questioning this ritual. You have support if you choose not to circumcise. We have a confidential list of hundreds of Jews who have chosen not to circumcise a son. And this is just an indication that the choice among Jews not to circumcise is not a rare one, is not an isolated one. There's company out there.
عقبالنا
We
كمسلمين
also know for a fact, because we've had contacts
برضه كتار
with
ما
Jews
يشتون
in other
أولادهم.
countries, in Europe, in South America, even in Israel, there are Jews who don't circumcise a son. So this is very important for Jews to know, that circumcision is a choice. And if you choose not to circumcise your son, you're not alone, you have company. Another very important fact is that your son is Jewish whether he's circumcised or not. Being circumcised is not a requirement of being Jewish. Even the Orthodox would agree that if the mother is Jewish, the baby boy is Jewish. And other branches of Judaism would accept a baby, that a baby is Jewish if either parent is Jewish. So there are many myths in the Jewish community about circumcision that relate to the Jewish practice, just like there are many myths among Americans that support non-religious circumcision. It's part of that dynamic that goes on with people who do this routinely. There was a reform movement in Germany in the 1840s, and there was some resistance to circumcision among physicians, among leaders, you know, but it was a temporary movement that eventually died out, didn't grow, and circumcision continued to be common practice among Jews there and elsewhere. Also around the 3rd century BC, in Greece, there was a movement to question circumcision, disguise circumcision. Jews wanted to fit into the culture there. So that was another historical period where there was some questions around circumcision. And I think even today, much of the questioning around circumcision is not recognized, is not known by a lot of Jews who assume that circumcision is universally practiced among Jews, when in fact it's not. And we have heard from Jews, not only here in the United States, but also in South America, in Europe, and in Israel, who not only don't circumcise their sons, but are actually opposed and want to support others to make the same choice not to circumcise. Well, circumcision has been a part of Jewish culture for thousands of years. And as I wrote in my book, Questioning Circumcision, it's likely that circumcision was practiced among Jews before it was written in the Torah. So one perspective, a historical perspective, might be that the idea that circumcision is commanded by God may have been a way to support an existing practice rather than something that initiated a new practice. So because circumcision is traumatic, there is a compulsion to repeat the trauma. And men who are circumcised generally have a compulsion to have their sons circumcised. As I've said before, most circumcised men don't recognize that they've been harmed. And as a trauma, they're repressing a lot of strong negative feelings about being circumcised. It's not in their awareness, but it does contribute to motivating them to having their sons circumcised, so they don't have to be uncomfortable about the fact that their son has a genital body part that they don't, that the fathers don't. So there's again, this psychological motivation to circumcise the next generation once one generation is circumcised. So this can continue endlessly, this compulsion to circumcise the next generation. And it has, obviously, for thousands of years. And the line where it continues, then we have this idea of tradition. And it's always been this way, and it always will be this way. So that adds to the mindset and the cultural pressure to not be the one who questions this ritual. So it's very, very difficult for Jews to question this practice of circumcision and to make a different choice. But it's happening, and again, we want to make that information available to people because it sort of breaks the mindset, breaks the links in the chain, and lets people know there's support for being Jewish and for not circumcising a son. Well, the response that parents get for not circumcising a Jewish son depends on who they tell. Of course, the family is going to know about it, and it's an individual thing. Sometimes grandparents might be very disappointed and lack some understanding about the choice. Other times, if there's complete discussion and people are given information about this, and they're made aware that other Jews support the choice of not circumcised, they can come around and be persuaded to support the choice not to circumcise. In terms of what happens with sending your child to religious school, again, it depends on what you want to disclose. I've never heard of any rabbi checking circumcision status of a boy, either entering religious school or having a bar mitzvah. So it's not something that's usually asked. It's very personal in the family. It's not something that most people are going to find out about unless there's a private conversation. So it's an individual choice. And what I hear from parents who haven't circumcised a son is they don't regret the decision, and it hasn't been any problem for them. I recognize that Orthodox Jews have a different belief system than most other Jews. Statistically, Orthodox Jews are about 10% of Jews. So their belief is, for example, that the Torah is the literal word of God. My audience is Jews who make decisions based on reason and experience, in addition to how they interpret the Torah and how they practice Jewish rituals and culture. That's the overwhelming majority of Jews. So that's the audience I'm seeking to reach. I accept that Orthodox Jews aren't going to listen to what I have to say about circumcision. That's okay with me. I'm at peace with that. I'm pleased and I welcome having a conversation with those who are open to having a conversation with me. And I hear from them, and you know, we're making a difference by having that conversation. Well, I can
كلامه يعني بيوضح برضو يعني التشابه بين المجتمعات اليهودية وبين المجتمع الإسلامي، نفس الفكرة. يعني أمس كان معانا أحد الضيوف في الحلقة بتاعتنا على الختان، الجريمة المقدسة، وقال نفس الكلام ده بالضبط، إنه هو اكتشف إنه الختان ده من عمر صغير إنه هو جريمة وحاجة اتعملت ضده بشكل سيء، وهو رافض الحاجة دي، لكن بسبب ضغط المجتمع رضخ للمجتمع وما قدر يعارضهم وختن أولاده. ففعلا ضغوطات المجتمع صعبة شديد، ويعني تحتاج لكمية هائلة من القوة وشجاعة إنك تواجههم، تقول لهم إنه أنت ما عايز تختن أولادك. يعني حتى لو مسلم الكلام ده ما موجه لله دينيين، يعني حتى المسلمين يمشي يبحثوا في المصادر. يعني أنا ما قادر أفهم الناس دي عندها يعني يقين كامل بإنه الختان ده 1,000,000% موجود في الإسلام. يعني في القرآن ما ذكر صراحة، ذكر في المصدر التابع من التشريع اللي هو السيرة والحديث وكده. يعني لكن برضو أنا بفتكر إنه بعارض جزء من الآيات القرآنية وبالمنطق والأطباء، ونفس الأدلة دي هي المشكلة. نفس الأدلة اللي بيستدلوا بها على ختان الذكور هي نفسها اللي بيستدلوا بها على ختان الإناث. فيعني أتمنى إنه الناس تكون يعني واعية وعاقلة، لأنه دي عملية irreversible، يعني لا يمكن تصحيحها. اللحظة اللي أنت بتقرر وتتخذ فيها القرار إنك تعمل العملية دي، خلاص يعني طفلك ده أنت خديته في مهب الريح. ممكن تحصل في العملية دي أي حاجة وهي أساسا عملية غير ضرورية. فيعني الضرر بدون أي سبب، طفل سليم توديه يحصل له نزيف، ممكن تفقده يموت، ممكن يحصل له أي خطأ أثناء العملية. حتى لو العملية ناجحة برضو أنت بتقسم من حياته في المستقبل حاجات كثيرة. أنت بتاخذ منه القرار أساسا إنه هو ده جسده، ومن حقه يقرر هو عايز يقطع الحاجة دي ولا ما عايز. يعني بتسلب حقوق كثيرة يعني، وانت ما عندك الحق تعمل الحاجة دي. فيعني نتمنى انه الناس توعى ما تكرر الجريمة اللي تم ارتكابها فيهم، لأنه هم ما عارفين. يا ريت الناس تبحث وتتأكد 1,000,000%، مش بس من الحاجات الشرعية، لأنه المصادر دي مش أكيدة. يعني انت هل سمعت الرسول نفسه بيقول الكلام ده؟ دي متناقلة من وعن. فيعني ولدك أولى إنك أنت تتأكد عشانه، ومش اتباعا بس كده زي ما قال الأخ مصعب. لو قالوا لنا خلاص نعمل، ما الواحد برضو بيفكر ويشوف المصلحة وين، هل في داعي يطبق للحاجة دي ولا لا، ويقرر بعد كده. آخر حاجة أنا بس بخليكم مع يعني طبيب بيتكلم بروجيكتور وبيشرح شرح جميل يعني عن موضوع ختان الذكور ومضاره، وشرحه شرح لطيف، فأخليكم معاه للآخر، وأتمنى لكم ليلة سعيدة.
Do biophysics research at Georgetown University, and I also coordinate two nonprofits that deal mostly with supporting families and supporting people in their relationships. Here's my family. So my mission in life basically is to help people get along, and towards that end I do a lot of workshops with families, and I also help families understand medical questions. So I'm here to talk with you about circumcision. I'm calling it the elephant in the hospital because it's this huge thing that happens as far as I see it in our culture, but we have very little discourse about it. It's performed between 500,000 and 1 million times each year in the U.S., almost entirely on infants within the first 3 days of life. And it's completely unnecessary and, I believe, based on my research, entirely harmful to children. So what we're going to run through as quickly as I can is just a discussion of like what that process is like from the child's point of view, what effects it has on adult survivors, how we get parents to agree to it, what understanding parents have, and how we get practitioners to be performing it. So before we do that, I actually want to get a sense of what our room is like, and so we can see each other. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. I'm going to use this technology here for room assessment that goes back before clickers. What I'm going to ask you to do, if you're willing, is to point in a direction as I ask you about each thing from beneficial. So this wall is like the beneficial wall, neutral is the ceiling, and harmful is the wall over there. So, for example, what do you think of foot binding? I mean, you're anthropologists. Most people have probably heard of foot binding. Where do you think it goes in the... Okay, we have everyone who chose to respond says that they think it's harmful. Great. I'm pleased with that response. Female genital cutting. How many people have heard of that? Okay, great. We've got universally harmful. Okay, what about, say we were to do prophylactic breast bud removal. Say we wanted to stop breast cancer, save hundreds of thousands of women's lives per year, and we just cut all babies' breast buds off. Beneficial, harmful, neutral? Okay, some neutral and some harmful. Okay. And what about cutting off non-essential tissue from a child? Say we just cut off all kids' earlobes because we thought they were inconvenient to clean or looked ugly. Okay, we've got harmful. Okay, so what about circumcision? What's our starting points? We've got every response. That's great. Okay, so we have a diverse audience. Now a couple other questions, just to see who we are. Who here thinks that they have a foreskin? Anyone? Who here believes that they have a foreskin? This is that part that they remove during a circumcision, right? Okay, so that's a trick question. Men and women, males and females, are both born with foreskins. The foreskin is just a name for a part of the clitoris or penis. And so probably most of the women here still have one, and perhaps some of the males also. Who comes from a culture where female genital cutting is the social norm? No one, okay. Who comes from a culture where male genital cutting is a social norm? Okay, all of us, pretty much, that I can see. Okay. And who knows someone who was genitally altered as a child? It could be you, it could be a friend, it could be your parent, your child. Most of us. Okay, great. So all that is just to illustrate how it's something that's touched all of our lives in some way. Now, so I'm arguing that it's this big thing and that we don't talk about it a lot. So I have to sort of explain why I think that. So I believe the discourse that we have in our culture about circumcision is one that's used to conceal what the nature of the process is. So you may have heard things like, well, it makes the penis cleaner or something like that. You may have heard things like, everyone does it, I'm circumcised and I'm fine, It's just a little snip, or it removes a useless flap of skin, the sort of trivializing language. We have heard all these things. What I'm asking you to do right now is to set all that aside, all that massive experience in your minds, and to try and come at it from a fresh angle where these sort of illogical arguments or support for it are not part of where you're thinking. I'm going to propose that circumcision is this cyclical process in our culture where we do it to children, they grow up, they become adult survivors, some of those people become parents, and they engage, and practitioners engage them in order to perform this surgery on their children, which, unlike any other surgery I'm aware of, in U.S. hospitals, it removes a healthy, unique organ part, actually with the exception of intersex genital modification, which it bears a lot of resemblance to in my mind. It removes a healthy part of the body. It's not used as a treatment. Doctors don't think they're treating the children. They know that it's a social surgery they're performing. It has significant complications. It's performed on minors who can't give consent. It's illegal. It's actually a federal felony to perform it on girls, but it's actually encouraged to perform on boys. It results in lifelong function loss, and the tissue is then used commercially. So, just a little context piece. I hear you, believe me, and I will show you evidence for that. I won't make such a radical claim without proving it. But let's just finish our context piece with both the geography and the history. So, this is a map of the world, sort of. And as you can see, green countries are places where genital cutting of boys is not practiced, generally speaking. The few yellow countries up in the northern regions are places where it's becoming legally questioned. Circumcision is now rare in Canada, England, and Australia, where it used to be practiced on babies also, but stopped in the 1950s after an article was published showing that it killed a number of children each year in England, about 14 a year in England. And so they stopped the practice there. And the other place, besides the United States, where it's done on babies, the other regions, most of the time it's done on adolescents in sort of sub-Saharan Africa and in Islamic countries. Now, how did we get here? Right? So it's become a medical practice rather than a tribal practice or a cultural practice. And that came about in the late 1800s when people had not the germ theory of disease, but the nervous excitation theory of disease. And they also had the Victorian morality. So people see what they expect to see a lot of the time. So you can find a lot of published medical literature showing that circumcision cured things like paralysis and epilepsy and hip joint disease and all sorts of problems that today seem very unlikely for the process to have cured. And people really thought that actually the intention was to harm the genitals of children. And they thought that would help them in the long term because it would prevent them from having so much sexual excitation. That, in the Victorian model, being the most dangerous kind of nervous excitation you can have. So, I should have given you a caveat, which is that there are going to be some, my apologies, there are going to be some graphic slides here, and I certainly welcome you to turn away at any point if you don't feel comfortable looking at what you see. And I will try to more often give you a warning when they're about to come up. I would also mention, actually in this sort of caveat piece, that I'm going to use language perhaps differently. I'm going to switch now to mostly calling circumcision genital cutting, because I think that's a more neutral term. It's a more accurate or descriptive term. I think circumcision euphemistically embeds our assumption that it's a fine thing. And the term uncircumcised I'm going to replace with the term intact, because likewise the term uncircumcised gives the sense that circumcision is the norm and that those who are not circumcised are simply not yet circumcised. And to illustrate that, it would be kind of weird if we called women who had breasts unmastectomized, right? That would be uncomfortable. And I think likewise, I hope to sensitize us to the discomfort of calling uncircumcised uncircumcised. So the next few slides will have some less comfortable things to see. And again, you're welcome to turn away if you want. So this is the section on the child. The procedure for the child, we'll run through what the procedure looks like. That's probably the most graphic section, along with the complications. And what I want you to think about is, it's oftentimes talked about from the parent's perspective. You know, oh, parents have a right to choose. I want you to question that discourse and think about what's the child's point of view? Who owns the child's body? What rights do they have? Why are we doing it to boys and not girls? What's that say about our view of gender? And so on. So, this slide shows 3 different representations of people in the genital cutting process. The top left is a young girl being circumcised in a culturally, in her cultural scenario. The top right is a young boy being circumcised in his cultural scenario, and the bottom right is a young infant boy in a hospital in the US. And what I want you to do is look at their faces. Just look at their faces, because I'm asking you to think about their experience. And to me, it looks like they're having a very similar experience. And yet, in our culture, I see us as being kind of imperialist. We're very ready to point the finger and say, oh, these terrible things these people do in these other countries where they practice female genital cutting. We're silent about the male genital cutting that occurs to children under the same conditions of hygiene and the same death rates in those countries. And we promote doing it to boys in this country. So, how do we do a circumcision? The next bits are going to be the most graphic. This is a circumcision restraint. They strap the baby down to it, and then they proceed with the procedure, which I'm going to show you a short video of. This is going to include sound, if I've hooked it up correctly. And again, you're welcome to not look at it. I find this uncomfortable. Okay, so I want to encourage you to take a deep breath if you've been having trouble breathing, like I have during that. And some things I think to notice are the sort of calm detachment of the physician's voice. So the physician is not at all distressed by this. And the way the baby's crying, I hear the babies crying as the way I hear babies cry when they're in extreme duress. Not, I'm hungry. So, beyond the pain of the procedure itself and the pain of the many days it takes to heal, there are a number of complications that a circumcision procedure puts a child at risk for. You can sort of divide them into 2 categories. Surgical complications, which go from the more minor, everyone has a scar who's been circumcised. A lot of men don't actually know that the ring around their penis is the circumcision scar, or they learn it when they hear my talk. But that always happens. But a number of other complications can be problematic that don't occur all the time, like penile adhesions. When the healing process goes awry and 2 parts of the penis that weren't supposed to be connected link together. And then these panels show in the top left A, that's called a fistula. So it's like a doctor-induced hypospadias. The black line going down is a probe that's entering the meatus, the opening of the urethra, and exiting out the additional hole that the physician has caused. And B is a nearly amputated head of the penis. C, so much skin of the penis was removed that the child's corpus cavernosa and head of the penis are lodged down inside the scrotum. And in D, the penis was accidentally amputated entirely. There are also a number of postoperative complications, ranging from difficulty breastfeeding, which is important because breastfeeding is a very important developing the ability to breastfeed is very important for children. Bleeding, which is another sort of minimizing term. You see that on consent forms, and you're like, oh, bleeding. Well, it turns out an infant has 12 ounces of blood. So bleeding a couple ounces may actually cause that child to die or need a blood transfusion. Increase in pain response, infection, which is also very serious for a newborn, myotitis, which is an irritation of the opening, and that also can be problematic because if it gets bad enough, the child won't be able to pee, and that'll cause you to need catheterization. Necrosis, and even permanent loss of the penis or death. I talked with a pediatric urologist. Those are the people who get the complications to deal with. And he said in a 2-year period, he had over 275 kids he had to treat, almost half of whom required surgery. So they were subjected to an additional surgery in order to attempt to correct whatever had happened. Okay, so that's most of the graphic stuff. Except for in the next few slides, we'll see some pictures of the actual anatomy of adults. So you're also welcome to turn your head aside at that. How many people have seen a penis that was intact? Either your own or a friend's, you know. Well, go see if you can find, if you haven't yet, see if you can find someone who's willing to show you. So I've talked with hundreds of men, you know, both men who've been circumcised and men who have not been circumcised. And I hear a lot of men who were circumcised feel upset about that. They are aware that something, or they've come to be aware that something was taken away from them, and that their body was subjected to something without their choice. I've also heard parents talk about their regret from the procedure. So what is the foreskin? The foreskin is this sort of socially constructed thing. It's really just a part of the penis, but since we cut it off, now we need to give it a separate name. In fact, a lot of potential complications lists that you get on your informed consent form say that one of the risks is that you might injure the penis. So we've actually constructed a reality or a view of reality in which cutting off part of the penis is not injuring it. It's only if you then cut the part that you had intended to leave that it's an injury. So I want to show you what the foreskin is. I want to spend some time on that. The foreskin in an adult male is the part that would have been removed. Is about 12 to 15 square inches. It's the size of a 3x5 index card. It is the most erogenous part of a human male. It contains 10 to 20,000 fine touch nerve endings, and it also makes the penis shaft skin motile. So it's the difference when you're having intercourse or some kind of sexual interaction. It's the difference between this kind of interaction and something like, if you can imagine a part of your body where the skin moves around nicely. My cheeks are floppy, so I can do that. And that's actually a significant thing because there's another kind of nerve called a stretch receptor that gets stimulated during that motion, and it's the male's contribution to mechanical lubrication during intercourse. Either male-male or male-female. The foreskin can be broken down in a couple specialized areas. The frenulum is this sort of, my hand isn't really long enough, but it's this fanning out region here. And then there's the ridge band below it. That's where most of the nerves land. And the dartos muscle is a cutaneous muscle that allows the foreskin to respond to cold or fear by surrounding the penis and pulling it in towards the body. In 2007, the first research ever was done to attempt to assess where the penis is sensitive. And they took a group of males who were intact and a group of males who were circumcised. And what you see on this colored graph here, the most sensitive regions are that sort of maroon color, and the second most sensitive regions are the purplish color. If we compare that to a circumcised penis, what you see is we've removed most of the most sensitive areas and left just this region around the scar, and the remainder of the frenulum is really where most men who are sensitive. And so you can compare them this way. But you don't have to believe me. If you can find a friend or two, maybe one who's circumcised and one who's not, and they'll, you can, or maybe yourself, you can look and see where the sensitivity actually lies. And for most men, it is in this region of the frenulum or the scar remnant. So just to get you a real picture, what John here has done, he's a photographer. He's taken a person with a foreskin and drawn these lines so that you can see how much tissue it is as it retracts. And the other difference I want you to note is that the inside, what it does is it generally surrounds the penis, so it, in a sense, it invaginates it. It gives it a closure, and that keeps it moist. So if you compare that with the circumcised penis, there's a lot, the tissue looks softer, moister, and warmer. In addition, there being a lot more of it. And it doesn't have the scar. Those arrows there are pointing to the scar, so you can see where that is. Now, I did want to invite, if you had any questions, it's okay to ask me as we go along, because I'm giving you a lot of information. Okay, then jumping along to the parent. Like I said, I've talked with hundreds of parents also, especially doing all this work that I do with parents. I've talked with many who, when they receive their child back, that's the moment at which they understand what they had signed up for. And so there's a problem with informed consent, both that the information is lacking and that parents are sometimes asked about it at an inconvenient moment, like such as when they're in labor, And they're also asked about it in this sort of values-neutral way. It's like, would you like a pillow? Would you like a cup of tea? Would you like your child circumcised? It carries the same sort of tone, And I'm concerned about that. So I view us as having this sort of manufacturing pseudo-informed consent process where parents need to trust physicians. They're the people the physicians are supposedly the ones who are bringing in the discipline of medicine. And so they come in, but they're given this information that is very cursory. It lacks real information about the complications. Those are trivialized. The foreskin functions are completely omitted. It's not mentioned that it's actually a sexual organ. And the ethical questions of making decisions about your children's bodies are omitted. And there's also this undeclared conflict of interest. There's really a lot of commercial use of the tissue. So the other thing parents don't know is that it's painful for a week or longer afterwards. So the baby's not only in pain during the process, but this wound has to heal. It's a wound on the penis, and babies are very sensitive to pain. How many people have gotten to play with a baby who is newly, you had a friend who had a baby or you had a baby a few days old? They're very fragile beings. And so what we've done is we've put this wound on this child, and now this new parent who's dealing with the healing process, the process of figuring out what it's like to have this new baby, also has this added complication. They have to watch for signs of infection. They have to keep changing the bandage, and their baby's more upset than he would have been. In comparison, if the child's not circumcised, all you have to do is, almost nothing. In fact, you don't even wash the penis. Just like you wouldn't wash your baby's vagina with soap, you just rinse it. You don't retract it. It becomes retractile on its own. And you have a baby with fewer health problems and who is more content. Now, I promised you that I would show that we actually do use the foreskin tissue. We use it for three things, right, that I've been able to find. We use it for research. So there are a large number of products you can buy from Invitrogen, which is actually a company I buy other things that don't contain foreskin cells from, for my biophysics research. And you can buy, so there are some of the product codes. You can go look it up yourself. They really sell things taken from neonatal foreskins. You can buy, at a hospital, you can get magic skin treatment, which is grown up foreskin tissue. And if you're very wealthy, you can buy cosmetics that are also derived from neonatal foreskins. Of the cosmetics? Wait, say louder. Oh, people think it'll make you less wrinkly. If you have, the idea is baby cells, they're young, they do their job well, And if you're disturbed by that, I'm glad, because I would like us to be disturbed by it. So let's hear from an obstetrician how they frame these sort of things. This is Lisa Masterson being interviewed on the Craig Ferguson Late Late Show.
Yeah, and again, but that's a personal choice. And I talk to my patients as an obstetrician, I talk to my patients a lot about this. And really there's a lot of health benefits and some risk benefits, but it's really a social procedure. So you really have to decide, do you want your son to look like you? Do you, is it a cultural thing? Is it a social thing? It's absolutely, and there's some health benefits, more for the lady than the man, but as far as decreasing STDs and passing on to, other women, HPV, which can cause cervical cancer, so decreasing STDs and cancers, all that good stuff.
But couldn't you achieve the same effect by washing your pee-pee on a regular basis?
You absolutely could. And
So we're talking, you can have this chopped off or you can wash it. Your call.
Exactly.
That's a tough choice there, Doctor.
So obviously I appreciate Craig's point of view there. Now he's from Scotland. Coincidentally, they don't do this to children. But think about her discourse. She's saying you have to choose as a parent. It's like this, and I want to question that framing of it. Like, do you have to choose other body modification options for your child? Like a nose job or things like that? And if the idea of, doing things to our children because we want them to look a certain way chills you, I'm glad. I want it to chill us. I want us to wonder, why are we so busy making our children look like what we think boys and girls should look like? In this case, we have this idea boys should look a certain way in their genitals. Okay, so the last section is, how do we get practitioners doing this? So I have a few quotes here from practitioners who stopped doing it, like Marilyn Milos, a nurse who, after seeing it, refused to assist with them and was fired for telling parents they don't need to do it. Michelle Storms, who's a very well-known obstetrician, who said she was ridiculed and patronized after stopping them in 1988. And I'm at Georgetown, so I went and talked to the head of obstetrics at Georgetown University Hospital. Obstetricians do most of them. And she says, medically, it doesn't make sense. I don't even like doing the procedure, but I do it well. I perform thousands of circumcisions. She was clear that it's a social procedure. She was clear that it doesn't make sense medically. And she told me in our conversation that she would not stop doing them. So how do we make physicians into that? Well, first we start by pathologizing a healthy organ. Not only is the foreskin absent from most U.S. medical and anatomy texts, there's therefore no education about the functions. It's not spoken of as a sexually important organ. Physicians are only taught how to remove it as a procedure, and they're mistaught care. They're mistaught this retract and wash philosophy, which is problematic because, as you can see down at the bottom, the foreskin, when you're born, is usually attached to the head of the penis. What you saw early in the circumcision video was the physician running this tool around to scrape the foreskin loose so they could cut it off. It's bonded like that to protect babies from, well, all the sorts of things that babies do. They might have feces or urine in their diaper. They might get scratched up. So the foreskin has this protective function when you're young. Gradually, that detaches, and the foreskin becomes retractable, but if you forcibly retract it, that tears it up and creates a site for infection. Also, if you wash with soap, that creates a site for infection. And finally, we make this misdiagnosis called phimosis. There's a true problem called phimosis, which is when there's scar tissue at the opening of the foreskin so it can't retract. And there are treatments for it using steroidal cream to help the scar tissue soften. But when we think that a baby who's 3 weeks old has phimosis because you can't pull the foreskin back without making the baby scream, that's wrong. It's actually meant to be attached that way. It grew that way, and it will become retractable on its own. So, why do we do the circumcisions? Well, if you look at why parents say they choose, the number one reason is appearance. They want their child to look like the other children they'll see, or they want them to look like their dad. Or they think it looks better, or they think it's easier to clean. And I believe that this solicitation by physicians reinforces or validates the choice to do this. You know, would you like your child circumcised? The fact that physicians do it makes it look like a reasonable thing. Physicians may also give several reasons to sort of collude with this idea. They may say that it reduces penile cancer rates, that it reduces urinary tract infections, cervical cancer rates in female partners that your child might have when they grow up, and female-to-male HIV transmission rate reduction is sort of the newest reason. So as I showed you in the beginning, we have this sort of cultural baggage. We have lots of reasons that we used to do circumcisions that don't make sense in today's cultural setting. So we've had to come up with a posteriori reasons in order to feel comfortable with what we're doing. But I'll analyze those in more depth. Besides the social critique that I think they're reasons we made up after the fact in order to feel comfortable with it, if we think about them carefully, appearance and cleanliness, the number one reason that circumcision is done. Well, that argument is used to support both male and female genital cutting in every culture that I'm aware of that either of those practices occurs in. And they're just made up arguments. I mean, how can you say that something's cleaner if you do one thing to it or another? Penile cancer. The American Cancer Society says, no, it won't protect you from penile cancer. And it's also irrelevant. The rate is about 1 in 100,000. More people may die from circumcision than penile cancer. Urinary tract infections. Well, that was based on a big study in 1986 done by a fellow, I kid you not, his name was Wiswell. And the problem was his instructions cause urinary tract infections selectively in people with foreskins because he told parents to retract the foreskin and wash with soap. So that's just like if you had a girl and you forcibly douched her, you would, a little girl, you would get a higher rate of yeast and urinary tract infections because you've messed up the colonies of protective bacteria. Cervical cancer in female partners. Well, first of all, a surgical preventive measure on an infant for a potential female partner when they grow up. I mean, how do we know this person's not going to be a monk or gay or, they could do it themselves later. But also, cervical cancer is caused by human papillomavirus. Probably most of you guys know that. You learned that in sex ed, right? Well, the same authors went back and looked at the husbands and wives in that study, and they had different strains of HPV. So I don't know if there was, under the table non-monogamy going on or what, but that throws the result of that study entirely in question because the husbands weren't carrying the HPV strain that gave the women cervical cancer. Gesundheit. Okay, so the last one, circumcision as an HIV preventative. That idea started in the 2000s mostly, and the evidence for it is 3 randomized control trials that were performed in Africa, probably because you couldn't get a human review board to permit such a study in the US. They got volunteer men who were willing to be circumcised. They randomly circumcised half of them, and they just watched to see how quickly they got HIV. That had some problematic methodology that I'll get into later. And their claim was that reduced the rate that the men acquired HIV by 60%. Now, the evidence against circumcision as an HIV preventative are pretty much all the other studies that have been done. The geographic data, if you look at correlations between circumcision percentage and HIV rates in populations, it contradicts this conclusion. For example, the United States has the highest HIV rate of any industrialized nation and also has the highest circumcision rate of any industrialized nation. You would expect something different if circumcision was so protective. So I've got a few minutes left. I'll quickly run through what I think was wrong with the study. So 3 studies, again, they took a group of men, they circumcised half of them, they watched how quickly they got HIV. The problems were, each time that people came to the clinic, they gave them condoms and safe sex counseling. But the circumcised group came at least twice more because they had to come to get circumcised and they had to come to get a follow-up study. In addition, if you're circumcised, it takes 4 to 6 weeks till you're able to have sex again. And the circumcised group was asked to abstain for 6 weeks. But they didn't start the clock after waiting 6 weeks. They started the clock at the beginning, so the circumcised group had 6 weeks of protection by being unable to have intercourse. In addition, they used an antibody test, which, if you go to an STD clinic and they use an antibody test, they tell you there's a 3-month window. You've got to wait till 3 months after your last exposure if you really want to know if you've got HIV. But again, they didn't start the clock after 3 months, and most of the benefit, or half the benefit, occurred during that first 3 months. So those infections occurred prior to the start of the trial, prior to the randomization and intervention. There were other problems too, a lot of missed controls, including blood exposure and receptive anal intercourse. I'm also concerned because the authors of those studies liken circumcision to an effective vaccine. Now, all they're saying is that if their results are accurate, which I don't believe, that it would reduce your likelihood of getting HIV, each time you had sex by 60%. So if you have sex enough, you'll get HIV anyway, with enough risky behavior. The measles vaccine, if you take that in its boosters, 99% of you would become immune to measles. Probably you are, actually. So that's what an effective vaccine looks like. 99% permanent immunity, not 60% less likelihood to get it each time you take it. And real human beings think that they're immune to HIV because they've been circumcised in African countries. And I think I'm very concerned about that. But anyway, so the recap, I think we have a social bias towards cutting children, particularly boys. I think that it's very harmful to children. It also hurts survivors. It hurts parents who really want the best for their children. And it also hurts practitioners because I believe that medical students come into school wanting to help people and they get taught about this procedure in an out-of-context kind of way. Most of the people I talk to think it's not their responsibility to do anything about it, including professional organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the practitioners, because their job is to keep practitioners looking good. So if you go against you say that something's bad that your practitioners are doing, that doesn't look so good. The administrators of hospitals and the practitioners there don't want to stand out. The obstetricians don't even think the child they're operating on is their patient. The ethics committee at the hospital told me that they're not the appropriate venue for this concern. And I think all of these organizations are neglecting parents, children, and us. So I'm hopeful that I've engaged you with some interest and that maybe you'll go and tell people about this, because if they're not going to take responsibility, I hope that we will. So tell your friends. I'm going to give this slideshow, a link to the slideshow, to your professor.
شكرا للمتابعة وأتمنى لكم ليلة سعيدة. شكرا. تصبحوا على خير.